Hello and welcome to the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke. I hope everyone enjoyed the Hall of Fame game Thursday night. Today we are talking first round fantasy football draft strategy. But before I jump into that, I want to let you know that now is the time to get a PFF Plus subscription if you haven't already. Right now we have an early bird special for $79.99 for a year-long subscription for first-time subscribers. That is $40 off the full year subscription. That is how you get access to my fantasy football rankings, all of my fantasy football articles, whether it's draft strategy, sleepers, league winners, players to avoid. That's also how you get access to all of John's IDP rankings and all of his fantasy content as well as premium stats and all of our fantasy tools, as well as our betting tools that'll be coming out. So you definitely want to pull the trigger on a PFF subscription now because our early bird deal ends on August 7th. So you have less than a week to subscribe. Just go to subscribe.pff.com and use code EARLYBIRD, or you can find the link either on the website or any of my social media. So definitely do that. And then also, if you haven't subscribed to the PFF Fantasy Podcast, definitely do so because we are going to be producing a ton of content over the next month. So you don't want to miss an episode. And it also helps us a lot as well. So definitely subscribe if you haven't already. Now we'll jump into my first round fantasy football draft strategy. Starting with the 101, I'm going with Jamar Chase. I know earlier this week on the podcast, I kind of debated if I'm thinking Chase or Bijan Robinson because it is so difficult to find running backs at the 101 spot in the second, third, fourth, and fifth rounds. But after thinking about it further, I think Jamar Chase still needs to be the 101 just because of how big the gap is between him and the rest of the wide receivers. First off, clearly one of the most talented wide receivers in the NFL, consistently grading at 84 or better each season. But it's so many other factors that go into Chase being the 101 at wide receiver compared to the other wide receivers. He is running a ton of routes every single season, running at least 37 routes per game each of the past 3 years, which is pretty unmatched at wide receiver. He is also the only elite wide receiver catching passes from an elite quarterback, with Joe Burrow being one of the top quarterbacks in the league and Chase catching passes from him. That is a huge advantage that Chase has over the other wide receivers. When you also throw in that the Bengals offense has stayed very consistent between last season and this season, the coaching staff has remained the same, the quarterback's the same, his competition for targets is largely the same. I know they just added Noah Fant at tight end, but that's not going to impact Chase's fantasy production at all. And then the defense should continue to struggle this season, which means the Bengals are going to be in a lot of shootout games. And when you compare that to other elite teams like the Eagles or the Bills or the Ravens, they're going to be in games where they're scoring a lot of points and winning games and then putting their foot off the pedal in the fourth quarter. And that's not going to be a problem for the Bengals. When you compare that to the other wide receivers, guys like Justin Jefferson, Nico Collins, CeeDee Lamb, a lot of the other wide receivers that you're considering either in the first round or the early second round, they either have a new quarterback, they have new competition for targets, they have a new coaching staff, there are concerns about injuries. For a lot of the wide receivers, there's multiple of these concerns, and none of those currently exist with Chase. And then a big thing last year was Chase wasn't the most consistent wide receiver from one game to another. He would have some elite games and then some games where he wasn't quite as involved. Last season, that was not the problem. He was a top 12 fantasy wide receiver in nearly 60% of his games, at least a top 36 wide receiver in 94% of his games. So very dependable. Even though we've seen it be very difficult for a wide receiver to be the number one player from one season to another, I think Chase has as good of a chance as any wide receiver in recent seasons to have a repeat season, and he definitely has a better chance of being the top overall wide receiver than any other wide receiver this season. At the 102, I'm going to Bijan Robinson. Unless Chase falls and goes to 102, 103 or something like that, then I'm still picking Jamar Chase if he's on the board. But if not, I'm going to Bijan Robinson next. Robinson really stepped it up, especially over the second half of last season. They started using him even more consistently, not substituting him out as often, consistently getting him his carries, consistently getting him his targets. That led to a 92.8 PFF rushing grade last season, which is excellent, exactly where we want to see him. And I think a big difference between Robinson when you compare him to some of the other running backs is when you look at what running backs do consistently from one season to another and what's a little less consistent. And typically a running back's ability to break really long runs isn't the most consistent thing. Obviously, the good running backs do it more often. The not as good running backs do it less often. But we saw Bijan Robinson not break that many 15-plus yard rushing attempts last season, and therefore not a lot of long rushing touchdowns. And those plays are huge for a player's fantasy value. Saquon Barkley, on the other hand, was elite at this in a way that we have never seen from a running back, and something that is very unlikely to continue from one season to another. If you take away the 15-plus yard rushing touchdowns from every running back last season, Robinson was the clear top back, and Saquon Barkley was RB9. So if all of those kind of break even for running backs, that's the kind of production we would see. But with Robinson, I expect him to at least have more 15-plus yard carries, Saquon Barkley to have less, and Jahmyr Gibbs, who was also near the top of the league, even though he didn't convert as many of them to touchdowns, also to potentially see a little bit of regression there. A big reason why Robinson, as well as guys like Jahmyr Gibbs and Saquon Barkley, are so far away from the other running backs is because of their offensive lines. All three have top 5 offensive lines. For Atlanta, they have a bunch of linemen who are excellent at making positive run block grades. They all have positive run block grade rates, which helps spring long runs. Those are the things that give the running back a big hole to run through and allows them to use their talent to break long runs, which made it especially surprising last season when Robinson wasn't doing it. So another reason why I expect Robinson to break more long runs is because he has the offensive line to help him do it. And a big reason why guys like Robinson and Gibbs are going to be near the top of the first round, as well as Barkley, is because they have both the talent and the offensive line, and there aren't other running back combinations who have that. So that's partially why you would want to consider a running back this early over a wide receiver, even though there's very talented wide receivers in this range. So I'm considering Robinson at 102. A lot of times he's also falling to 103. If both Jamar Chase and Bijan Robinson are off the board, that's when I'm pivoting to Jahmyr Gibbs. Gibbs is another running back who I think can have an excellent season. Just touched on it a little bit. He is one of the few elite runners who also has a great offensive line. He, even when the offensive line wasn't playing that great, was playing better than almost all running backs do. So that is also helpful for him, especially with some of the changes they're having in the interior of the offensive line. But I think a big change for Gibbs that'll be helpful for him is the change in offensive coordinator, going to John Morton. The big thing that was holding Gibbs' fantasy production back is the rotation that he had with David Montgomery. David Montgomery would start games, play a lot in the first quarter. Then as the game went on, we saw more and more Gibbs as Montgomery wore down defenses. But it sounds like Gibbs is going to get more opportunities early in games, which will lead to more touches in general. There were reports earlier this week that he was taking the first rushing attempts in practices with the first team, which that wasn't what was happening in past seasons. So I expect Gibbs to be more involved. Maybe not quite to the level that we saw late last season when David Montgomery was injured, but still to a point where he can be a lot more reliable to fantasy managers and potentially be the top overall running back. And when you're comparing him to guys like Saquon Barkley, like I said earlier, concerned that he's going to have a lot of touchdown regression and long run regression. And then compared to Justin Jefferson, I think Justin Jefferson is capable of having a great season this year, maybe even one of the best seasons we've seen from him. But there is that concern with JJ McCarthy and how good he's going to play. Also concerned that the Vikings could become one of these teams that's winning a lot of games and running the ball late in the game. They invested at running back this season. They invested in the interior of the offensive line. So they might be a little less pass heavy. And then we also have TJ Hawkinson, who should be more fully recovered from his injury. Jordan Addison, who's hopefully reaching the peak of his career. So a lot of reasons why I'm concerned about Justin Jefferson, even though I think he also is capable of being the number one overall wide receiver this season. But it's that risk reward and the number of other wide receivers I like this season compared to the number of running backs I like this season. That's really what's pushing running back near the top of the list for me, especially in the first half of drafts. Then if I have anywhere from the 106 to 112, assuming Chase and Robinson and Gibbs and guys like Jefferson are off the board, then there is a lot of players to consider, and there's no clear consensus right now of who you should be picking. And Brian Thomas, even though he has an ADP in the early second round in most places, he is someone that I think is capable of being that third overall wide receiver this season behind Chase and Jefferson. He played excellent over down the stretch last season, was one of those top 3 fantasy wide receivers over the second half of last season, was excellent in every situation, especially when he was lined up in the slot. And I think that works very well with Liam Cohen, their new head coach, who has worked with slot receivers and made them elite fantasy options in the past. In 2022, it was Cooper Kupp, who was the top fantasy wide receiver in fantasy points per game. In 2024, it was Chris Godwin, who was among those top couple before his injury. So I think Brian Thomas is capable of being better than those 2 players. Thomas was the top player in yards per route run from the slot among those with 100 routes from the slot last season. And I think with the changes Cohen will make in the offense, I think it'll help Trevor Lawrence in a way that it helped Baker Mayfield. It should lower his average depth of target, get some quicker passes out, and a lot of those quicker passes I think will go to Thomas. I know they did draft Travis Hunter, who should also have a great season at wide receiver, but we have seen plenty of teams have 2 fantasy capable receivers, whether it's 2 wide receivers or a wide receiver and a tight end. Even going back to last year with Tampa Bay, it was Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, who weren't healthy at the same time a lot of the time, but during the stretch that both wide receivers were healthy, they were both elite fantasy options. So I think it doesn't have to be either Travis Hunter or Brian Thomas Jr. I think both of them can have great seasons. And I think when you consider Travis Hunter playing a lot on defense and offense, I think it would be difficult to move Hunter around at wide receiver as well as playing him on defense. So I could see them leaving Hunter outside, which will allow Brian Thomas to play in the slot. And then Jahmyr Brown, their other wide receiver, also has been primarily an outside receiver, more of a deep threat in his career. So I think Thomas should be taking the majority of snaps from the slot. Cohen has also talked about multiple times in interviews how they want to move Thomas around more this season and use him in ways that you didn't necessarily see in college. So I am very much considering Thomas from 106 to 112 as long as he's on the board. If you want to shy away from Thomas or you're hoping he slides to you in the second round, then I think there are plenty of options either at running back or wide receiver to consider. Christian McCaffrey has been slowly but surely working his way up draft boards. I know a lot of people are high on CeeDee Lamb, but I think Nico Collins is capable of having an excellent season as well. Another player who is sometimes falling to the second round, of course, Puka Nacua, even higher than that. So especially if you're in the middle of the draft and you're hesitant on Thomas, Nacua is probably a player that I'd be considering. But definitely, if you don't want Brian Thomas Jr. for whatever reason, it would only be a running back or a wide receiver I'd consider in the first round. It would be too early to get a tight end or a quarterback outside of Superflex leagues. So that'll wrap it up for the PFF Fantasy Podcast today. Hopefully that helps you make it through your first round just fine without any kind of concerns. Again, just a reminder that we do have our PFF Early Bird Special going on. It goes on until August 7th, so you just have a couple more days to get that $79.99 price for the entire season. And again, if you like this content and want more of it, definitely subscribe so you don't miss any of it going forward. And if there was any first round strategy that you like or any players that you're considering that I didn't talk about today, feel free to comment it as well. So we'll be back next week with plenty more podcasts with both myself or John and I, or John will also have some, as well as check out all of our written content at PFF. Also, if you missed the Hall of Fame game, have my Hall of Fame recap up right now too. So until next time, peace out.